We are wrapping up our series today on Jesus as the key to the good and abundant life. Each week we've looked at a statement in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, I am, and then he tells us something about who he is. And he told us in John 10:10, I've come that you may have life and have it in abundance. And so I am convinced that if we know who Jesus is and we follow him truly into the depths of his being, that we will begin to experience that good and abundant life, that the life following Jesus is a good and abundant life. And today we're looking at John chapter 6, verses 31 to 35. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Whoever believes in me will never be hungry. Whoever comes to me will never be thirsty. And I'm convinced that if we hunger for Jesus, we lead the good and abundant life. Hunger for Jesus leads to the good and abundant life. And that's what Jesus is getting at in this passage. What are you hungry for? That's a question. What are you hungry for? Because I think we are all hungry. That's what it means to be human beings. That's what it means to be alive. So often, hunger. Now, have you ever heard of the Minnesota starvation experiment? Have you ever heard of that? Do you know what that is? Okay, during World War II, there were a number of men who were conscientious objectors, and I'm sure you know some of those guys. Maybe you are one of those guys, that the way that they lived out their faith following Jesus, the Prince of Peace, was to seek an alternative form of service. Some people served through the military. These folks said, I don't feel that I can do that, and they served through alternative kinds of service, and not to disparage either one, but that's what they chose. And they chose to serve doing work of national importance, or at least that was the idea in different parts of the country. And some of these guys were asked and signed up for a starvation experiment in Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota. And the idea was that as the war was wrapping up, and as Hitler's forces were falling across Europe, that the Allied forces were encountering these populations of people who had been starving, right? It's the midst of war. How do you get them back to health? And what they did was run an experiment and reduce the caloric intake of a set group of guys. They regulated their calories very carefully, how much food they got, and see what happens to their bodies. And these guys signed up for it. Now, some of them couldn't stick with it because you get hungry. And there's a lot of temptations. They'd let them just go around. But some of them really saw this as like, this is a sacrificial way for me to live out my faith. And they went through the entire experiment, and they dropped massive amounts of weight and had some different things that happened. But at one point during this starvation experiment where they're testing to see what happens to a person's body if they don't eat, one of the guys, he was walking downtown. He was so hungry, just kind of like dreaming about food. And he walked by a donut shop, and one of the guys went into the donut shop, and he bought a whole bunch of donuts, but not to eat because he's committed to the experiment, but he bought the donuts and went outside and just fed them to kids that were around and just watched the kids eat the donuts and just kind of vicariously enjoyed the donuts. Another guy, at the end of the experiment, he'd been starved for this set period of time. When they finally allowed him to eat, he was so hungry that evening, the first day out of the experiment, he had to go to the hospital and get his stomach pumped, right? Because he was just so hungry that he kind of gorged himself on all of these things that he'd wanted to eat. The Minnesota starvation experiment, what are you hungry for? Because we are hungry beings as human beings. We long for food. We long for things. We're hungry. What are you hungry for? Because Jesus said, come to me, hunger for me, and I will show you the good and abundant life. And so, as human beings, we hunger to hunger. We love to love. And Augustine, a theologian in the 4th century, he wrote, I was in love with love. My soul was in rotten health and in ulcerous condition. It thrust itself to outward things, miserably avid to be scratched by contact with the world of the senses. And part of what that I understand there in Augustine's words and looking at this experiment in Minnesota is that, our hungers can kind of take on this life of their own. and they can become something that exists as an end in their own. We become this thing, avid to be scratched by contact with the world of the senses. We start to define ourselves sometimes by our hungers. And think about this a little bit. How do we define ourselves by our hungers sometimes, right? Because we are hungry beings. We're hungry for something. We're like, hey, I'm the guy. And this is what I like. I like, the color blue. I like bicycles. I like chickens. That's who I am. I like chocolate and kale. And we kind of define ourselves by these things. It's all right to laugh. We define ourselves by these things. We're like, that's me. I want those things. I'm hungry for those things. That's who I am, right? And you can just fill in the blanks, right? Just put in whatever you like. I like TV. I like whatever. I'm hungry for those things. And it's not all bad. That's just human nature. But it's part of this deep hunger that we have. It's in its broken form that we have a word for that, where we define ourselves, where the hunger becomes who we are. In its broken form, it's called addiction, right? That's where hunger is its own end. And our whole life is ordered around scratching that itch. We beg, borrow, and steal to satisfy that hunger. And that can be satisfying for a time, even when we're not talking about addiction, because we hunger to hunger, right? And sometimes our only end is to augment that hunger. I remember once I visited the Mexican grocery store and the community that we lived in Washington, and they had this glass case filled with like these kind of yellow, dried out shrimp. And I thought, well, what in the world are those? And I like to try new things, so I bought a little bag of those. They looked at me funny, didn't know why. Went home with my bag of dried out shrimp and tried them, and they tasted like salt. That was all they tasted like, crunchy salt. And I thought, why in the world would you want these things? And they just went on the counter or on the refrigerator or something. Well, later a friend of ours, Mexican friend of ours, comes over and says, well, why do you have these in your house? I said, well, I just was curious what they were. And she said, Pastor, the only people that eat those are guys that are in a drinking binge, and they want to kind of up their thirst, make themselves thirstier so they can drink more. Pastor, why do you have those? I'm like, they were going to go in the trash, actually. We sometimes just kind of hunger to hunger more, right? And that hunger starts to define us. All we want to do is up that hunger, augment that hunger. And satisfying hunger can be, that can be kind of satisfying for a little while. I mean, King Solomon, he thought this in fits and starts. In Ecclesiastes 2:24, he said, look, there's nothing better than for a man to eat and drink and enjoy his work, right? Just enjoy the little things. Yet at the same time, he knew that satisfaction is an art, and that it doesn't come from meeting the need and filling the stomach and scratching the itch, that there is something more. And that same Solomon, Ecclesiastes, he said, all things are wearisome, more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. We're wired to want. We are wired to be hungry. We are wired to consume. But satisfaction, that's an art. That's something we've got to learn. It's not easy. It's why Paul called it a secret in Philippians 4:12. It's this existential state that we share with every living being that there is. We need to eat. We need something. We're hungry. But at the same time, as human beings, we are longing for, in capital letters, something more. Just look at the Bible. I mean, in the biblical story, think about the very beginning. Think about the Garden of Eden, how it all starts. What is the fall of humankind? It has to do with hunger, right? Eve looks at the tree and she sees that it is good. She sees that it will lead to knowledge of good and evil, and she eats some and shares it with the man, with Adam. And it's all downhill from there. One great rumbling in the belly of humanity that led even to this hunger for God that becomes disordered and confused with a hunger for approval, a hunger to be the right one, to be justified before God. And Cain kills Abel, and we've been trapped in that cycle of hungering ever since. Eve saw that tree, and she wanted it, and she needed it, and she ate it, and it's been a cycle of hunger ever since then. David Matsko McCarthy, who's an author, he says this, that we are in this contemporary economy of desire. It's an economy of passion and hunger. And he says that the promise of desire is that we will come alive and transcend the ordinary. At least I think that's the subtext a lot of times. But listen, if the problem is that we hunger for the wrong things, that we are defined by our hungers, then it'd be easy to be like, well, if that's the problem, then maybe what we need to do is learn not to hunger, right? Like if hunger is what led to the downfall of humanity, if hunger for something that is not God is what leads to sin, then maybe we need to learn how to not hunger, except that not hungering is impossible. Because our hungers are so deeply rooted that there is no us that does not hunger. Are you following me? Our cells hunger, our souls hunger, our brains hunger, and that longing to consume goes all the way down. And it's true that you got to learn to control your hungers, and Jesus, he cautions against unbridled hungers. He says in Luke 21:34 in the Message, and I like this, Luke 21:34, he says, "Be on your guard. Don't let the sharp edge of your expectation get dulled by parties and drinking and shopping." But Jesus does not propose not hungering as the solution. I think ultimately what Jesus gets at is having a proper hunger, a hunger towards what matters, a hunger for what is right. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And what matters most deeply is Him. And this is what Jesus is talking about when we hear Him speaking in John chapter 6. He said, "I'm the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Jesus has the audacity to say, hunger for me. Come to me. Be satisfied in me. And I think this leads us to a very profound prayer, one of maybe our most basic prayers, which is, Jesus, feed me. And Jesus says, come to me. I'm the bread of life, right? No, you're never going to find anything that satisfies you like me. And He's the only one that is worthy, as we read in Revelation. He's the bread of life. And it's not because He removes all our other hungers, but it's because our deepest hunger is only going to find abiding satisfaction in Him. This hunger at the root of who we are, and it's only going to be satisfied when we come to Him. And then all of our other hungers are going to line up, and that leads to the good and abundant life. Hunger for Jesus lead the good and abundant life. If we hunger for Jesus, if we are satisfied in Jesus, if I ask the question, what are you hungry for? And the answer is, I want Jesus, then all of the other hungers fall into line. We desire to honor God above all else. We become the kind of people who aren't even interested in the dried out shrimp and all of that. What are you hungry for? Are you hungry for money or the usual suspects? Are you hungry for compassion? There's some of the trickier ones. Are you hungry for approval? Are you hungry for success? Are you hungry for pleasure? Are you hungry for power? What are you hungry for? Because only Jesus really satisfies. I think that at its root, all of our hungers come down to a hunger for God. All of us know that we are estranged from God. At some basic cellular soul level, we are desiring God, and we're trying to fill that with other things, but only coming to Jesus, the Son of God, is going to really satisfy us. Alexander Schmemann, who is the late Orthodox priest, he said this: man is a hungry being, but he is hungry for God. Behind all hunger for our life is God. All desire is finally a desire for Him. Jesus anticipated this. He expects that His church is going to be a place where His people are fed and fed on Him. It's why when He stood on earth with Peter, one of His disciples, He said, "Peter, do you love me? And if you love me, then I want you to feed my lambs. I want you to tend my sheep. I want you to feed my sheep." It's no accident that feed is in there twice. Jesus, feed me. It's a basic prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, bread of life, feed me. Because you know what? All the other hungers are going to pass away, but the hunger for Jesus will be fed into all eternity. Jesus gives us all that is necessary to live this kind of satisfied existence, and paradoxically, that comes from a hunger for him. Mennonite missionary Christine Lindell Detweiler says, people need Jesus as much as they need food. Do we believe that about ourselves? Do we need Jesus as much as we need food? Do we believe that about others, that what people really need is Jesus, that their deepest hunger, despite what they might be telling you, is for Jesus? And Jesus doesn't just give us the bread. I mean, listen to what he says. He says, I am the bread. Right? I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me, you'll never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. He is the bread, which is what he's talking about when he speaks in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, verse 17. He said, hey, you conquer, you follow, you stick with me. I will feed you on the hidden manna, just like God fed our ancestors in the wilderness on the manna. Now, one of the ways that we learn to hunger for Jesus, to have a good and proper hunger for him, is to meet him at his table. And we're going to do that here in a little bit. It's to share his life in bread and cup. Our own poet, Dan Pohl, writes in his poem, Lectionary of the Land, waves through wheat animated on the land that offers us resurrection, twining through it, recognizing its sense, its focus with time that shapes the years, and then a west wind which breathes fire for new grasses that speak benedicere, the Latin long forgotten, sharing our life, our bread. We bring our hungers to his table, and through this shared bread, we share the life of Jesus, the one who satisfies our deepest longings. What are you hungry for? Jesus, feed us.